Good afternoon, everybody. This is Alan Falcon, CEO of Cumulus Global, and I want to thank you for joining us here for our August 3rd Tuesday at 3 webcast series event, Email Security and Reliability. I also want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day and week if you're watching this and our on-demand recording from our website. And I want to thank Brian Westnedge from Redsift, who will be joining us a little bit later in the session for part of the conversation and some discussion about solutions as we look at some of the email security risks and issues out there. Before we get into the content of the session this afternoon, as always, a reminder that the audio is muted. This is to prevent any background noise from getting in the way. So if at any point in time you have a question or a comment, the best way is to use the questions window. There's an icon on the top or right side of your screen. And we do have time left at the end of the presentation for Q&A as well. All of our webcasts are recorded. We generally are able to process them and get them up onto our website within 24 hours. Once it's available, we will send you the link to it, and feel free to share that with colleagues if you feel they will find this information valuable. Our live webcasts and recorded webcasts are just some of the resources we keep in our resource library. We work to make that library robust and relevant to you in your IT planning and IT journey. Related to today's topic, there are a number of other resources available, as you can see on the screen, including last month's webcast, where our focus was on security and compliance on the email side of things. We have information on our blog about some of the current state of cybersecurity for small and mid-sized enterprises, as well as the effect of the Kaseya RMM attack and what's that effect on our industry and what it means to you as a user of technology, even if you're not working with an IT company that uses Kaseya as the remote monitoring system. In our library, we've got some more reports on security and the current state of security, some original content, as well as data provided by third parties, including Microsoft and Google. And at any time, if you want to learn about security and protecting your business, simply search CPR on our website. CPR is the acronym for our model for comprehensive small business security, which is the C is communicate and educate, the P is protect and prevent, and the R is respond and recover. And those are the three components of any good cybersecurity and security protection. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let's dive into the content. And a reminder about some important statistics we're aware of and what's sort of driving our, almost drumbeat on the need for better security and protections, particularly in the email space. And right now, we know that 1 in 5 small, mid-sized businesses report being attacked by ransomware. Now, granted, not every one of those attacks is successful, but many are, and that's a fairly high percentage. And so the myth that SMBs aren't the target of hackers is just that, it's a myth. With that, when you look at those cyber attacks, 79% happen because of compromised credentials. And compromised credentials can come from another source, from a number of sources. Well, they can come from, breaches of third-party systems. They can come from, human interaction and social engineering. The fact is that when you look at those 79% of cyber attacks, more than 90% of the successful attacks start with an email. And that's why we're here this afternoon talking about email security and reliability. And part of that is because the same tools that get used to stop spam can inadvertently stop legitimate messages if you're not a trusted sender. And so email security isn't just protecting you on the inbound, it's making sure that people who are receiving your emails, their systems will know that you're trusted and trustworthy, and they shouldn't block or quarantine or discard your emails coming in. And when we think about the scope of the problem, right, it seems small that only 0.2% of spam emails contain malware. But if you think about the total volume of email on the internet right now, that is a huge real number. And if you think about how many email messages you get in a day, chances are you've got malware in multiple email messages per week or several per month. 7 minutes is the average length of a boutique phishing attack. That's how long it takes for someone to get the email, click on a link they shouldn't have, follow through, and boom, you're hit. And when we look at, particularly emails seen by Gmail today, which is the world's largest email service, 68% of phishing emails are new variations, meaning the cyber attackers actually now have algorithms that generate new types of attack, so that if you're familiar with current attacks, you still may fall prey to new attacks. And so the threat is out there. Some additional numbers, and then we'll talk about what we do about this. We know that of network compromise attacks, 50% started with phishing or social engineering email. Again, that's why we're here today: security and reliability. And people think that a lot of phishing attacks and these spam emails are going to consumers. The reality is businesses receive 4.8 times the number of targeted attacks than individual consumers. And right now, the average amount lost in a single phishing email asking for a wire transfer is $75,000. Now, you might be a small business and you control the money and the email system and would know that you didn't send an email or didn't receive an email from someone else in your company. But the number of companies that actually wire transfer funds is significant. And it's just indicative more of people, of the bigger issue of people not recognizing that they're answering a phishing email. And so we see obviously wire transfers and those big numbers, and you might think, gee, my company's small enough that couldn't happen here. But we've also seen attacks where people think they're being told that they need to reset their password, and in actuality, or confirm their password. In actuality, they're just giving their account credentials to your Google Workspace or Microsoft 365 environment to a cyber attacker. So most people start and say, well, gee, how do we secure our email, and how do we make sure we're reliable? And they'll start with the secure email gateways, and we're a proponent of that. And in fact, both Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace, depending on your licensing, to various extents, have the features of secure email gateways built in. But this is a foundation, not a solution, because even when we look at the enterprise editions of our email services, they're still running with fixed and static rules, even though the threats are constantly evolving. And these tools will focus again on content, looking at the content of the inbound email, even advanced threat protection solutions that sandbox email messages. They're primarily looking at the content. And the better tools are looking at domains and IP addresses and saying, does the content say it's coming from one place when it's actually coming from another? But they're not actually verifying who and how the email was sent. And so secure email gateway services, whether it's a physical box that you're running for an on-premise server, or it's Microsoft Defender for Office 365, or it's Zix Protect, as a managed service that we offer, they do a great job, blocking malware, but they still can miss impersonation attacks and business email compromise attacks. And a business email compromise attack, BEC, like the name suggests, is where someone is able to send a message that looks like it's coming from your business. And we have seen businesses victimized by the fact that someone has stolen the business identity, as well as those of individual executives or employees, to launch attacks on other third parties. So let's start with the basics. And again, if you want a little more information about these basics, you can go back and look at portions of last month's webcast. We covered them in a little more detail, but for content and timing here today, we won't repeat all of that. Most companies have SPF records. That's the sender policy framework. Now, surprisingly, many companies don't. Or if they change services, they don't remember to change their SPF record. So what does sender policy framework do? It identifies all of the authorized email senders for your domain by IP address. You think, well, that's great. If I have a list of IP addresses, then people will know if the email comes from that IP address, it's there. Well, the problem is that when you set up your SPF record, you tell the recipient how to treat email if it doesn't actually match a specific IP address, right? When we are using services like Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, both of those services tell us to configure our SPF records with what's known as a soft fail, or the tilde all, as opposed to a hard fail, a minus all. Why? Because Microsoft and Google, to maintain their environments, are constantly adding and subtracting servers. And so their list of IP addresses is constantly changing. And while they update those lists in real time, it takes time for that to propagate through the domain name service across the internet. So there's a chance that someone may receive an email message. If you're a Google Workspace customer, you might send an email and And your client or your customer or a prospect might be receiving an email from an IP address that hasn't yet propagated through the include file into your SPF record, and you don't want them to reject that email out of hand because it is a legitimate email from a legitimate source. So it does allow authorization for services where valid sending IP addresses change often, but it opens a loophole. Additionally, really good hackers and spammers can spoof an IP address. And so you can have email that looks like it's from a valid IP address, but isn't. The next tier, so that's like good. The better tier is DKIM, or DKIM, Domain Keys Identified Email. And what DKIM does, it goes another step further, in that it confirms responsibility for email and that content has not been altered. And so effectively, as email gets sent with DKIM, it gets encrypted using a public key. And therefore, from that point on, if you can decrypt it with that public key, you know that the addressing and the content and attachments of that email have not been altered. However, the challenge with DKIM alone is that in order to certify the content, the headers have to be modified. And that can actually increase the risk that legitimate email from you gets flagged as spam or junk by the recipient, because the header has information in it that's atypical to a normal email. Okay, so there's challenges with DKIM as well. So SPF is good, DKIM is better. DMARC is where we get to the best. And DMARC stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. And here you're setting a policy that gets relayed to any service that sends email from your domains and that relates to any service. So you specify how your email is to be authenticated that it's from you. And the recipient email service will then authenticate per the method you prescribe in your DMARC records. Okay, and it does build upon SPF and DKIM. So SPF and DKIM are prerequisites for DMARC, and they work in conjunction so that email comes in. What this does is it creates an authenticated domain. And if your domain's authentic, it cannot be spoofed or impersonated by bad actors. So this means your CFO can't get an email that's been spoofed from the CEO saying send money here. Employees can't get email spoofed from the head of IT about confirming passwords. Third-party businesses can't get an email that looks like it's from your business saying you're looking to order merchandise, right? And ship it to some new location you're setting up, and then the recipient thinks it's legitimate. They ship it, they don't get paid, they come after you for the money, and it's a huge headache and a hassle, right? So authentic domains cannot be spoofed or impersonated. This sort of closes the loop and fills in the gaps in both the SPF and DKIM protocols. And so now I'm going to bring in Brian Westnedge, Senior Director at Redshift, and have him talk a bit more about DMARC, as well as on DMARC, which is a solution we offer as a service that helps get DMARC set up and running. And one of the reasons we're partnering with Redshift is that industry stats tell us that over 50% of companies that start to deploy DMARC actually never finish the process. And Brian will talk a little bit about that and how to move forward. So Brian, welcome, and thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks, Alan. Great to be here, and appreciate the audience taking the time to learn a bit more about the subject. One I'm extremely passionate about. I've been in the DMARC space since the beginning, and happy to share some of my learnings with you today, and then give you a really short demo of how we implement and, along with Cumulus, get customers to DMARC enforcement. Perfect. Thanks, Alan. So Alan touched on this already. DMARC essentially exists because in the past, companies adopted the current authentication mechanisms like SPF and DKIM, but found that their domains were still being spoofed. So the simple reason for that is that SPF and DKIM both authenticate values in the email header that the end user of the message never sees unless they open a header, which most folks will not. So DMARC is the modern email authentication standard. it at the most basic level authenticates the actual visible from domain we see in our email headers. So it's in our email client, I should say. So the domain you see when you open a message at the very top, you'll see the name of the sender and then their domain. That is the domain that DMARC authenticates. And DMARC doesn't solve every single problem around email phishing and spoofing, but it does solve the use case of protecting your own domain from being impersonated, and helps actually improve the delivery of mail from your domain once you authenticate it. So most folks, are familiar with the corporate mail that goes out of their domain. If you're using Google Workspace or Office 365, most folks have a pretty good handle on that mail, but they may have less visibility into all of the other cloud services that are available today that might send email as well. So your typical Salesforce platforms, marketing platforms, customer service platforms, HR, payroll. There's, the world is now, we're of course in a cloud era, and SPF in particular was not really designed with today's cloud services in mind. Email inherently wasn't designed, with any thought of where we are today. And we're kind of bolting security onto email, way after the horse has left the barn, if you will. Email's been around, since I think the original RFC was for SMTP mail was in the 70s, and originally designed as a one-to-one protocol for communication between, government employees and folks at higher education institutions. So today's world with mass communication of email across many channels, across many platforms, has been a challenge to date, and that's why we still see spam in our inbox and spoofing and phishing. Alan touched on this. A gateway is definitely the foundation of stopping a lot of attacks, but there's no one solution that can stop every single type of email attack. And if somebody says they have the ultimate solution to solving for spam and spoofing or phishing, I would look at that person like they were a snake oil salesperson for sure. So maybe next slide, Alan. I'll talk a little more about what DMARC can do. I think essentially DMARC gives you governance over your email program and your email domain. So the first thing it does on top of what SPF and DKIM do is provides this reporting layer of how your domain is being used for emails. So receiving mailbox providers like Google, like Yahoo, like Comcast in the US, they send DMARC reports back to a service provider like on DMARC. The system will interpret those reports. It will extract the important information out about who's sending email on behalf of your domain. You might be interested in potentially shadow IT projects that have spun up without your consent. Maybe there's actual systems sending mail for you legitimately, but you haven't authenticated them yet. So DMARC will give you visibility into that, and it certainly will give you visibility into malicious actors that might be trying to leverage your domain for some nefarious purpose. So it really is, in a world where some of us, we may be a little tired of kind of black boxes, especially when you get into security. Sometimes it's really hard to explain, how the problem gets solved. DMARC is not really that in my estimation. DMARC is not a black box. It simply says, does this message authenticate properly for the domain it claims to be from? And if it doesn't, then apply the domain owner's policy to that message. So it's very it's binary, I should say, and it is not a black box. And the challenge with DMARC, Alan, is if you go to the next slide, the challenge with DMARC is if you don't implement it correctly, it can be a tedious process, and you can potentially block legitimate mail. But maybe taking a step back, I'll just say why DMARC matters today is, we hear about various ransomware attacks. Certainly, the number one cause of ransomware attacks is phishing. No surprise there. The number one cause of data breaches is phishing. you guys, with the help of Cumulus, are probably doing a pretty good job of shoring up your infrastructure. So the best way for an attacker to get access to your organization is through people. If infrastructure has been shorn up, the way to get access to people is through phishing. So, the modern attacks that we see today are not the attacks of old, the old Nigerian Prince 419 scams. They are modern, they're socially engineered. They may not have any malicious content in them, like Alan said, is your gateway is really good at analyzing what's in the message, and then DMARC's all about who sent the message and can you trust them. So in today's world, there's some market drivers around adopting DMARC. There's some government mandates in the federal government in the U.S. U.S. federal agencies have to implement DMARC. We see that federal mandate, state and local governments now want to abide by that. If you're getting cybersecurity insurance, sometimes being a DMARC compliance is part of that. If you ever do risk assessments, a lot of times lack of DMARC is highlighted as risk because, frankly, without DMARC, your domain is open for impersonation. So the challenge is this all sounds like a great idea, but as Alan mentioned, we see far less DMARC compliance than we'd like to. A lot of people start the project and then never get to DMARC enforcement. So if you start the project and your domain always remains unprotected at a policy of none, you're really no better off from a security perspective than if you never started the project at all. So that can be because DMARC reports come in these XML files, are not really human readable. A lot of folks, DMARC is an open spec. So a lot of folks are like, hey, I want to see what this is all about. They'll publish a DMARC record in DNS. They'll get these reports. They'll look at them. They're like, I can't really make sense of these. And they'll kind of give up the project. Or they might be like, I cannot impact the delivery of my legitimate mails in any way. I don't want to do anything that might cause my legitimate mails to have some sort of deliverability issue. Or then the last thing is a lot of folks are like, well, I use an email gateway today, so I'm good. On the last point, all modern email gateways will check for DMARC authentication on inbound mail. I think Alan mentioned this, that Office 365 and Google Workspace, they check all inbound mail automatically for DMARC compliance. Most other kind of commercial email gateways, you can create a rule to check for DMARC. So DMARC is built into all major gateways today, but your gateway doesn't help you get your own domain to DMARC compliance. It won't give you the DMARC reporting and visibility that you need to authenticate all of the other mail streams that send for you, not just your corporate mail gateway, but again, all those third-party cloud services. So all of these reasons, kind of tend to why, folks may start a DMARC project and then abandon it. And then hopefully I can demonstrate to you with our On DMARC platform how we can make a tedious and sometimes scary project a lot easier with the help of Cumulus on the implementation side. So next slide, please. Perfect. So that leads right into the demo. I think, Alan, if you could make me a presenter, then I'll share my screen and we'll visualize some of the stuff that I've been talking about.
Will do. Okay, and I'm transferring the presenter over to you.
Okie doke. There we go. Righty. My screen. All right. Looks like we're good to go.
We are good to go.
Perfect. So when you put a DMARC record in place in DNS, you're essentially telling a receiving mail gateway, hey, send reports about this domain to a email address that I've specified. In this case, it may look something like an on DMARC reporting address. So if I go back here and look at this demo account, I've set up this fake domain cumulusdemo.com. This is what a DMARC looks like in DNS. So it's a text record. The host name is _DMARC. If you look at the value of this, it kind of looks like an SPF record, except the version is going to be DMARC 1. We're still on version 1 of the spec. The policy is none, which means you're telling a receiving mail gateway, hey, if my message fails authentication, take no action on it. So this is where Cumulus would start with every customer is you start with a DMARC policy of none. This just gives us reporting and visibility, and there will be no impact on your legitimate mail flows. And really, to do an assessment with us, and would be happy to do a phishing assessment for you. You really, the only work on your side, and frankly, Cumulus might be able to do this for you already, is put the DMARC record in place, point the record to our platform. You can see here, you're telling a receiving mail gateway, hey, if you see a message from my domain, send a report about it to on DMARC, which is our platform. So that's where we start. Once you publish that record, we start getting reports in about 24 hours. And what we'll see is some interesting things. Is you'll get a daily report of all the mail you're sending, how much of it is passing authentication, how much of it is failing. The failing part is what we want to look at. We want to see, why are these messages potentially failing authentication. You can come down now, and this is going to be the interesting part, is we have kind of aggregated all the different senders that we're aware of and displayed them in kind of logical order here by, in this case, email volume. So for this particular demonstration domain, Mailgun, which is a marketing platform, is the largest volume sender for this domain. They send from IP space that has a very good reputation. We use Spamhaus data to source kind of this reputation information. In this case, this mail is 100% compliant with DMARC because it's passing both SPF and DKIM. Great. So everything looks good for Mailgun. You can see you also don't have to scroll through a bunch of IP addresses or host names. If we know the service that sends mail for you is Mailgun, we're smart enough to detect that and say, okay, it's Mailgun versus 192.0.1.567. So you'll see those every once in a while, because sometimes you might be using an on-prem system that sends mail from you from a dedicated IP that we've never seen before. Maybe use some shared IP space from a different provider. But the most important information is going to be getting information on all these cloud services that may not be or may be used in addition to your email gateway. So in this case, we're looking through all this stuff. Oh, wow, we've come down to Google Workspace. We see, it spends a fair amount of email, but in this case, none of the mail is passing SPF and very little of it is passing DKIM. So this would be something that Cumulus would want to work on with you, is why is your DKIM compliance so low? Why is none of the traffic coming from your domain passing SPF? And these are some easy fixes that they can do with you to get your email DMARC compliant. In this case, MailChimp, okay, that's a very common marketing platform, maybe set up by somebody in marketing that is not aware of authentication, and just started sending out messages without them authenticating. So the first step in the DMARC process is just get this visibility of who's sending mail on your behalf. Then you, as the domain owner, in concert with Cumulus, you'll want to decide which of these services is actually authorized to send mail for you. And then of the ones that are authorized, then you want to authenticate the authorized sources of email. If there's shadow IT that potentially is not authorized and you don't want to authenticate, great, then we won't touch it. And then once you get to DMARC enforcement, that mail will get blocked. Also, if there's malicious mail coming out of your domain, we'll see it here, and it's probably mail that you don't want to authenticate. I can't remember this demo. Okay, good. So here's a host sending for your domain. It's out of Vietnam, sending quite a bit of mail, and it has a really bad sending reputation. And if we clicked into this, we'd probably see that it's sending from IP space that's not set up for email or something like that. In this case, I probably wouldn't expect SPF to be passing at all, but this is demo data. But you'll be able to see kind of at a glance, okay, anything in green, more than likely it's legitimate mail that just doesn't authenticate properly, but anything in red is something that we're going to want to take a look at. So that's all helpful to see. This is kind of what we would call DMARC aggregate data. So in the aggregate, how much mail are we seeing from this domain, and where is it coming from? There's also a type of DMARC data called forensic data. And this can, as it sounds, it's going to provide a little more information on the message. So we're never going to get any personal information. We're never going to get any message bodies. This mail is provided to us by mailbox providers like Yahoo. In particular, we get a data feed from Yahoo of this forensic data, and they'll be redacting any sort of PII in the message. But the data that's remaining is super helpful for troubleshooting. So in this case, we can see, okay, the left-hand side of the email address, that can be really helpful in certain situations for troubleshooting. We'll get the return path, which is commonly known as the SPF domain or the envelope from domain. We'll get the subject line of the message, which can be very useful to figuring out, hey, is this a legitimate mail campaign that I sent, or is it phishing? In this case, the message is coming from IP space in Vietnam. If you know for sure that you should not be sending email from Vietnam, this is probably spoofing of some sort that can be blocked once you get to DMARC enforcement. So you can drill down into the message, get all of that information. We can see this is probably more detail than you would want to see or would need to see if you're working on this project with Cumulus, but your consultant at Cumulus will be able to help you, interpret these authentication results and say, hey, this does not look like it's legitimate, coming out of Vietnam, using a weird SPF domain that doesn't pass. It's trying to send mail with DKIM, but there's an error. This is going to be more than likely phishing. If there's any URLs in the message, we'll extract them as well and display them. So that can be useful for troubleshooting too. So just additional data that will help us feel comfortable and confident when we go to DMARC enforcement that we're only blocking the bad stuff and we're not affecting any legitimate mail. So that's super interesting to know. If you've marked some of these email sources as legitimate senders of mail for this domain, like if you are confident that you use Amazon SES, you're confident you use Google Workspace, somebody in marketing has spun up MailChimp or Mailgun, and maybe you have a Mimecast gateway, we're going to give you some information about the particular mail service. So in this case, hey, Amazon SES, if you want to pass SPF for SES email, you need to use this particular include statement. We're not seeing that in your DNS today, so you need to put that include statement in your DNS if you want to pass for SES. MailChimp, they typically use 2 DKIM keys that they rotate between. So you need to publish these DKIM keys in DNS for MailChimp to pass. So that's great that we tell you that. And frankly, if you wanted to do this manually from here, you could. The nice thing is on DMARC makes it really easy to authenticate all these mail streams without making all these manual DNS changes or telling Alan and his team, to make those DNS changes for you. So we have a really nice feature, a unique feature of the platform called Dynamic DMARC, where we would host your SPF, DMARC, and DKIM records for you. So either you or Cumulus don't have to make changes manually in DNS. You'll make a one-time change in DNS to point, in this case, your SPF record to us. So your SPF record will have this one include statement that references the on DMARC domain. In this case, if we've said, hey, these are the 5 different services I want to authorize for SPF, that's all you need to put in here. You don't need to know the underlying IP addresses. Frankly, you don't even need to know that Mimecast uses this particular include statement. So if I want to add, I guess I can't do that from this screen. I can't. I wanted to add a new include statement for Salesforce, but we can find that from another screen. I think off the top of my head, it's going to be like spf.salesforce.com. Don't quote me on that, but you can add that. Or if I went back to the email sources screen here, where I've listed all these services here, I can just look up, I know I use, these are just some common ones. I know I use, let's just say SendGrid for marketing email as well. I can just say that. I don't have to know the particular include statement under here. I just say, I want to authorize SendGrid. And now if we go back to this list of services, SendGrid should be on here with the particular include statement. So all of this is kind of behind the scenes. The magic of this is when you put this one include statement in SPF, the response looks something like this. So if I'm a receiving mail gateway, I look up the SPF record for this domain. This is going to be the SPF response. So we basically dynamically flattened all of the IP address ranges in this include statement, in the Google include statement, in the Salesforce include statement. We've dynamically flattened those and removed duplicates. So your SPF record essentially is never broken. You never have to worry about what's called the 10 lookup limit of SPF. So if you put all these different include statements in your SPF record today, it would likely break because it would exceed what's called this 10 lookup limit, which says that an SPF record can have no more than 10 lookups when it's being evaluated, or else it breaks. So it solves a real pain point for a lot of folks around SPF management. We also host the DMARC record for our customers. So if you one night were running into a real issue with spoofing attacks, you could call Alan and say, hey, Alan, I really need to go to reject on my domain because we're under attack and everything, all of our legitimate mail is authenticating correctly. So either you or Alan could come into the console and say, hey, I want to move the DMARC policy of this domain from quarantine to reject, or you could go the opposite way. If you were a reject, you could roll it back to none while you authenticate kind of a new source of email. So this gives you control of the DMARC record. Similarly, you can control the DKIM keys from the console as well. You publish one name server record for DKIM in DNS, and from then on, you add your DKIM keys from the console, or your Cumulus consultant will add that from the console for you as well. So it's a really elegant way of managing DNS changes. I think we all can probably agree that DNS was not designed with email authentication in mind. The less you touch DNS for purposes of email authentication, the better. And we thought we'd just make it easy in a user interface for you to manage these records and get to DMARC enforcement. Again, you'll always be working with Cumulus on that. So that's kind of a unique feature of our platform versus just any sort of DMARC reporting you might come across. A few other things to touch on. DMARC reports typically come in once per day, once every 24 hours. So there might be a situation where you're doing some troubleshooting on a particular email domain, and you've made a change to authentication for a particular service and you want to test it, and you don't want to wait 24 hours for the DMARC reports to come in. Well, we basically built the DMARC checks ourselves. If you send a message to a particular seed address from your mail platform, we will do all the SPF and DMARC checks for you. So if I just look at this test message, I send an email to that seed address, and about 10 or 15 seconds, we'll do all the checks and display them here. So in this case, we're looking at this particular message. It's not passing SPF. There's no SPF record for this particular domain. It's not passing DMARC because there's no DKIM or SPF record. The DMARC policy is none, which means that no mail will be blocked. No DKIM header or signature found in the message. Let's see, we'll do a TLS check, so we'll make sure that the sending platform is using TLS. We'll look at the forward fully confirmed reverse DNS, just make sure that the forward DNS matches the reverse. We'll extract any URLs from the message to help you troubleshoot. Again, we'll bump the sending IP address and domain against Spamhaus to make sure that you're not inadvertently listed on Spamhaus with your legitimate mail streams. We'll check for the presence of something called BIMI, which is a really interesting new spec that is basically a reward for getting to DMARC enforcement if you have a well-known brand and you want to get basically some free impressions out of that. A reward for getting to DMARC compliance is you can display your logo in a mail client in the avatar section. So instead of the default avatar, sometimes you'll see initials or sometimes it'll be blank, especially in Google Workspace. You'll be able to see your company's trademark logo in that avatar spot instead of that default avatar. So it is a reward for getting to DMARC enforcement. It's certainly a process that we can talk to you about at the right time if it's something that's of interest to you. You get a special certificate from a certificate authority like Entrust, who typically issues SSL certs and other types of certs. This is a cert specific to BIMI that says you own this trademarked logo, and that you have the rights to use it in email because you've gotten to DMARC enforcement. So really interesting, but it brings what typically has been an IT and security project, makes it more interesting to people outside of IT and security, people in marketing potentially, if you have a well-known brand that want to basically leverage the IT and security work to get the domain authenticated and compliant, then you reap the rewards. It's because people like Google really want domain owners to adopt authentication. And the stick they use is, especially in Google, sometimes you'll see a little question mark avatar in the UI when a message is not authenticated. The opposite of that is BIMI is the carrot is, hey, domain owner, this is the benefit once you get to DMARC enforcement is we'll display your logo. So that's an interesting emerging space. Google just went generally available with it last month. So you'll start hearing more and more about it as time goes on. The system will also give us some activity logs. So if you wanted to check and say, hey, who's been doing these different modifications to my domain, we can see, hey, this guy Brian, modified dynamic DMARC. He said SendGrid was a known good asset. He's done all this stuff in the UI. So you got a little bit of an audit trail. You can come in here if you wanted to analyze your supply chain. If you're doing business with somebody and you're just curious to see what their DMARC compliance policy is, you can just put a domain in here and take a look. The World Health Organization is just obviously one of our larger customers, but they were heavily spoofed during COVID, and they implemented DMARC, and we got them to DMARC compliance within a few weeks. There's some notifications, so we send email notifications, so you can get a notification, hey, just saw Mailgun sending for your domain, or MailChimp, or some other domain service. You probably want to take a look at that. If you guys are really into Slack, we have a Slack bot that you can connect. For heavily advanced users, we have a RESTful API that you could use. I mean, I would expect that the majority of you would be working with Cumulus on this implementation. We have customers that never log into the UI and would rely on their Cumulus contact to do all of this for them. But I did kind of want to show you how we visualize these reports, how we ensure that we've got complete visibility into all of the legitimate services sending mail for your domain. That ensures that we never block legitimate mail inadvertently. All legitimate mail gets authenticated. Anything you don't want authorized gets blocked. So if a malicious actor decides to spoof your domain, he or she will not be able to do it. And it's not super advanced today to spoof a domain. There's plenty of web forms available, free web forms on the internet that you can use to spoof a domain. There's phishing kits as a service you can rent if you're a little more sophisticated. It is not hard to spoof an email in today's age. And the best thing you can do as the domain owner to protect yourself from that is to implement DMARC, get your domain to enforcement, and you can be sure that communications you get that are from your domain are legitimate, and communications your customers and your supply chain get from you are legitimate as well. So, Alan, I think that was probably a little too exhaustive a demo, but hopefully it kind of sets the scene for what DMARC can do. And I think, again, doesn't solve every email impersonation, phishing, spoofing issue. As we all know, you need to take a layered approach. DMARC is the best way to secure your own domain from being used without your permission. And that's it. So let me
okay, so I've transferred control back, and thank you for the demo. I think you definitely hit on a lot of details, and I know it might be a little technical for folks, but I think it's important to understand the depth of the sophistication of the protocol and the service, and how it helps. And so when we look at the takeaways, it's really about stopping business email compromises and improving deliverability, making sure that as more companies put in more protections, your mail is reliable and will reach its target. And it's interesting, you talked about, when email was invented, no one was thinking that far forward. When email was invented, it was really using the postcard, right, as the model, right? You write a postcard, you put it in the mailbox. The post office is going to make a best effort to get it there, but there's no guarantee, and it might take longer than you think or less time. And there's a chance that someone's going to read it along the way. And that's how email started. But obviously, our need for security and privacy has grown. Another good takeaway, it's cloud-based, it's serverless. We're not putting hardware and infrastructure. It works with any email gateway that we offer or that you may have in place. We can help you. Our partnership with OnDmark lets us get you to enforcement quickly, safely, and easily. Again, you won't be spending money and investing in a service only to abandon it once it's set up and never actually bring it live. And that really is the support and the role we play at Cumulus Global as your managed cloud solution provider. And the pricing is simple. It's per user per month. And so it scales with your business on a per user basis like so many of your cloud services do. So what are your next steps? You can actually check your current SPF, DKIM, and DMARC posture. Don't use the link here. There's actually, hold on, a better link for that I'll send out in the follow-up email. I'm sorry, I apologize. I thought I had changed it. And think about the value proposition, the cost benefit of what we're looking at doing here, and the cost of inaction, your business being at risk or important emails not getting through. We always recommend that you plan your changes. There's policy, people, and technology that come into play as you roll this service out. And then obviously, as part of what we're here to do is execute. With half of DMARC implementation stalling before completion, we're here to make sure it's up, it's running, it's complete, and you're secure. On that note, I do want to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask away. And open that questions window on the top or right-hand side of your screen. Okay, while we're waiting, there's some common questions that we often hear about the service. And first of those would be, do you really need DMARC even though you already use SPF and DKIM? And do you want to answer that, Brian?
Yeah, no, that's a common one. I'll be talking to someone who says, "Oh yeah, I'm good on email authentication because I've implemented SPF." The reality is most modern email gateways, like I touched on, they won't fail a message simply because it does not pass SPF. So I think most big mailbox providers realize that folks have far-flung infrastructures these days. They're using many cloud services. Sometimes those cloud services use different SPF domains than the from domain. There might be some really old legacy gateways, used by really small organizations that still would reject a message if it fails SPF. But in my experience, that's fairly uncommon. DMARC is the modern authentication protocol. As I mentioned, O365 and G Suite are checking it by default. So that is the spec you want to measure your program against. SPF is good on its own. DKIM is good on its own, but it's not sufficient actually for protecting your domain for email impersonation. So, it's possible before DMARC, if I was a malicious actor, I could spoof a domain as the visible from domain, let's just say IBM.com. I'd use that as my from domain that people see in the mail client. My SPF domain could be a completely different domain, like briansaspammer.com, and I could pass a basic SPF check for that message because SPF, again, checks this value in the header that you don't see unless you open the message. So one of the reasons DMARC exists is to kind of bring that identity alignment into play. DMARC says either the SPF domain or the DKIM domain must match the visible from domain. So all that means is SPF on its own, your from domain can still be impersonated. That's the important takeaway there, because if I'm a malicious actor, I'm much more likely to spoof a trusted domain than I am an untrusted domain. And if I can look up in DNS, and I showed the example of a DMARC record, that's a publicly available lookup in DNS. So if I'm a malicious actor, I'm going to look up your domain before I spoof it. I'm going to see if you are at DMARC enforcement. And if you have no DMARC record on your domain or your DMARC policy is none, then I'm much more likely to impersonate you. So SPF on its own is part of the DMARC spec and process, but on its own, it will not protect your domain from impersonation.
Okay, great. And Now you have mentioned that it's impossible to stop all spoofing attacks.
Mhm.
And but clearly, DMARC is the most effective. But I think the key message there is that it only works if you use it.
That's right. If you think just by putting a DMARC record in place with a policy of none, that's going to give you any extra protection over somebody that has no DMARC record, that is incorrect. From a security perspective, your domain can be impersonated unless your DMARC policy is quarantine or reject, fundamentally, where you keep a malicious message out of the inbox when it is a spoofing message. So yeah, the reason this product exists and why Qmos is working with us is DMARC has been tedious, and this process with on DMARC makes it a lot easier. And you actually you complete the project. You win the prize, which might be your logo displayed in a mail client, or better delivery of your legitimate mail once it authenticates. But that you're not a soft target, that you won't be dinged if you're ever doing some sort of risk assessment, and most importantly, a malicious actor will not be able to spoof your domain. That's if you're going to start the DMARC journey, your goal should be DMARC enforcement, and that's where Alan and his team can help get you there with on DMARC.
Okay, and I want to apologize when I have put up the correct link, so you can investigate your current SPF, DKIM, and DMARC posture at https://sift.red cumulus-investigate. If you use that link, you'll get a complimentary assessment that'll give you your current status quo and help you decide whether this is something you want to move forward with. And again, our role in this is on DMARC is the service. It's the company we're partnering with to provide this. We do it as one of our managed cloud services. So you can go into the admin console and do everything yourself. You can have us help you as you need, or you can turn it over and say, get us up and running, work with us, guide us through the project, and monitor and help us manage. And we're happy to do that. That's the role we play. And so at this point, I do want to thank everyone for joining us here today. And for those who are watching this on demand, appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy day and week. Brian, thank you so much for coming in and providing some great information in an in-depth demo. Again, if people have further questions or information, I'll go back 1 second. Our company contact information is on the screen, as is my personal contact. I don't have an assistant, so if you send me an email, it's going to go to my inbox. My phone number's there. I should really take it off because I'm bad at answering voicemails. Best way to reach me is afalcon@cumulusglobal.com, or feel free to send an email to our general inbox, info@cumulusglobal.com. Myself or one of our cloud advisors will get back to you quickly. So thank you for joining us today. Have a great day. Have a great week. And we hope to see you next month as well.